You're listening to Empire by Design, episode 63. Hey, I'm Katie White, coach, consultant, transformation facilitator, action taker, empire builder, and this is Empire by Design. In this show, we're building empires, we're sharing stories, and we're getting up close and personal on the strategies that make an empire in today's online world. Get all the show notes, past episodes and more at katiewyatt.me. For now, settle in for the ride. Hey Empire Builders, welcome back. In this episode, I am sharing a recent webinar I did all about how to pitch a podcast. I wanted to share it with you all because there are insane benefits to being featured on podcasts, as you would know, because you're listening to a podcast and you know how much you fall in love with guests that you hear on podcasts. And I have worked out through all my pitching and through all the pitches that I get on my podcast that there's pretty much 3 key steps to getting featured on podcasts. And most people forget at least 2 of these steps. So in this episode, I am going to show you how to find the right podcasts to pitch that are set up for, that are setting you up for a win-win relationship, how to make the pitch, because that's kind of the important part, and how to get maximum mileage and benefit from the interview and the new relationship you've just developed with a podcaster once you're done. Let's get into it. Hey Empire Builders! This episode is brought to you by my 7-day podcast challenge. If you want to explore where a podcast fits into your business strategy and model, because I'm all about podcasting entrepreneurs, so we want it to be a key part of your business model, I am helping you do it in a fun, interactive 7-day challenge. You can start at any time you want, and I'm always there in the associated Facebook group adding my live support. You can be podcasting in 7 days in a totally strategic, aligned, organised way. Go to podwellcourse.com/7DPC to sign up. Now let's get into this week's episode. You are here for getting booked on podcasts, and this is really what we're going to talk about today. So getting booked, it's not just about getting booked for the sake of being on a podcast and feeling a tiny bit famous. It's actually about using the podcasting platform as a really incredible way to grow your influence and deepen the relationships that we're all trying to build with our target market. So the things that I want to run through today are clarifying your message, because that is really the key first point. If you don't know what your message is and how you cut through the noise with that message, then your pitches aren't going to go very far. Also identifying places to pitch, because you could get yourself on dozens of podcasts, but are they the places that are going to grow your business is a different question. We'll also talk about making the pitch and nailing the interview. So you got the yes, how do you prepare for and make sure you do a rockin' interview, and maxing the mileage after the interview is released. So let me jump in. Now, most of you know me and know me quite well, so I probably don't need to introduce myself, but for those who don't know me as well and who are listening in the future onto the recording, hello future. I am Katie Wyatt. I am a podcaster. I have 2 podcasts currently, planning my 3rd. Don't talk about it. I'm a speaker. I'm a teacher. I have this transformation facilitator, which basically means I help people get shiz done in all sorts of different forms, whether it's business, social enterprise, podcasting. Action is my middle name. So I'm also a Facebook group facilitator. I believe most of you are in my Start, Grow, Thrive, the Empire Builders Facebook group. I also have a smaller group for podcasters, people who want a podcast, and people who would like to be on podcasts. So if you're not in one or both of those groups,
please come over and join. Those two bit.ly links will get you in there. So yeah, we'd love to see you in there and we can keep this conversation going. And my pitch cred. So I love pitching. I've guest pitched successfully for more than 50 guest blogs, magazines, podcast interviews, and I've also been a paid speaker and guest trainer multiple times. So I think I definitely get no's, and I don't think pitching and pitching craft is about never getting a no. That's impossible. But I've experienced the highs and the lows and kind of learned it all by doing, really. And as a podcaster, I get dozens of pitches. I'm getting pitched all the time, and I often say 90% of them are not right. It doesn't mean they're terrible. We have the small selection of the ones that are terrible, that are just here's my supplement, buy it and put me on your podcast. But most are fine. They're just not right for me. And that's the group that I think having a bit of craft behind us can really help with. So first up, clarifying your message. So this is about just being really clear on what you have to say about what you do and your philosophy on, what you teach, what you coach in, all of that stuff. Just being really clear on how you tell that story, what are the stories you have to support the message that you're putting out into the world. And the way that we do that is by knowing who our audience is, knowing the results that we get with the work that we do, avoiding jargon, because that obviously is the first thing to just make people tune out, and niching down. So that's about being much more specific with who we're talking to. So how do we do this? Knowing your audience is, it's not just to be able to reel off all the demographics that describe your target market. It's also understanding their problems, what keeps them up at night, what desires do they have that they're really looking to, solve or achieve through a service or product like yours. The FBD is something that my new friend, Kate Toon, talked about in her talk at We Are Podcast, and was a really good reminder of a framework to think about your ideal audience through. And the FBD is just fears, beliefs, and desires. And it's a really nice way to think about your audience and what do they fear, what do they believe, what do they desire. And you really want to craft different parts of your messages and pitches around these sorts of things. Knowing the results that you get is about knowing the outcome that your work or your product has on people. And that's not just features, which I think we all have a tendency to go back to the features, but it's about the benefits. So if you're a health coach, it will be about the benefits that the work you do brings to the person that you're working with. But if you make beautiful labs like Karen does, then the benefit might be something different. It's probably more of and Karen, you'd know this better than I would, but when somebody buys a lamp, they're not just buying a lamp when it looks as beautiful as Karen's, they're buying a whole set of other emotional benefits. So it's getting really clear on what those are for your product, service, and your audience. Also avoiding jargon. So this just means being really clear and specific. I know I have a tendency, because I have a background in corporate, I'm very fluent in corporate speak. And it's something that I have to constantly remind myself not to fall into, because it's a different language to what my market and entrepreneurs are speaking in. So just a simple one, but important. And niching down. So this goes to your message and to the pitch that you make, is talk directly to one problem and solution or one type of person. And we'll get into kind of how that plays out soon. So where to pitch? The first question that it's really important to ask is, what is the purpose of your pitching? What I realised, I started doing lots of interviews because people with wellness podcasts were inviting me onto their show to talk about my wellness story. And look, I'm totally happy to do that because I know that I have an interesting wellness story, that cancer and all of that sort of jazz. But what I realised very quickly was I had this great CV of interviews, but none of them were talking to my audience or creating any benefit for my business. Now, that was okay because I just love doing podcast interviews, so it was fine. But I have actively, over the past 6 months, been thinking about, well, I need to be talking to the right audience and I need to be talking about the right things. So yes, my personal story helps people get to know, like, and trust me, but does it get them to think, well, I'm going to hire her to help me launch a podcast? Not necessarily. So you just got to think about why you want to be pitching, why you want to get on podcasts, and then assuming that answer is clear for you, the next step is who has your audience, which podcasters out there are already talking to your audience. And there's lots of ways that you can work this out. So one is to ask yourself, were you ever your ideal client? And many of us in service businesses I know were at 2 years ago or whatever. So it's really looking back to what you were reading or listening to on your journey is one way. Another thing is to ask your tribe, assuming you have a tribe or you're in Facebook groups where your tribe are hanging out, is ask them, ask for what are the podcasts they're listening to and why, and just get that information. And then another way is to think, who is an aspirational leader in your field that is a few steps ahead of you, and look at their website, see where they've been featured, and you go into the iTunes search bar, into the podcast store, and search for their name, and you will find every interview that they've done. Really good example of this one is Denise Duffield-Thomas, obviously a money mindset guru. If you search for her name, if you're a money mindset coach and you're kind of wanting to access a similar audience to Denise, go and search for Denise's name in iTunes and you will see that she's been interviewed on an enormous number of podcasts. So that's just a cool way to find some places to pitch. Another thing is if you find one podcast that you know definitely has your target audience, for example, if it was my podcast, if you go to my podcast in iTunes and scroll down to the bottom underneath where all the episodes are listed, you will see iTunes will tell you what are the other things that people that are listening to my show are also listening to. So it's a really good way to find, not just identify one podcast, but quickly identify 10 podcasts that you may want to think about pitching. So a note on competition. I think it's our inclination to think, well, if somebody's doing what I do, then I can't, and they're podcasting, I can't pitch them to be on their podcast because they won't want me because we both do the same thing. And I want to say that is just a fallacy. There will be some people who are competitive who don't want to have direct competitors on their show, and that's fine. But I have found that most of the time people recognise that people buy people, and the person that will buy me is very different to the person that will buy the next person that's offering the same sort of services as me. And I've been on numerous podcasts and I've had who are doing similar things to me, and I've had people on my show who are doing similar things to me. So don't let that stop you, is my point there. Okay, so next up, we found, at least 10 podcasts already quickly that we know we want to identify, we know we want to pitch. So the next part is about making the pitch. So first of all, and this is where your message that we talked about first comes back into play, it's about the angle, which is how you're going to take your message and craft it into an angle to pitch to a podcaster. And it's all about that podcaster's audience. So a lot of people lead in a pitch with their story, and they think that having an interesting story is enough. Like, I get this all the time because my podcast is called The Wellness Entrepreneur, at least until next Tuesday. A lot of people come to me and say, I have a really interesting wellness story. I was this, and then I was that, and then I was highly stressed, and then but I got well, and I'd love to share that with your audience. Now, if you actually listened to my podcast, or even just scanned the episode descriptions, you'd realize that I'm not necessarily just sharing personal stories of wellness, or if I am, it's the personal story of an entrepreneur, and I'm actually more interested in the entrepreneur, their business, which is in the wellness space. So, it's about thinking, well, yes, I have an interesting wellness story, but how can I make that relevant to this podcaster's audience? And that's where the angle comes in. So thinking about what are the really outstanding things about you and your story and your business, or where do you do things differently or feel differently to others about high level topics within your niche. I'm going to give you examples of all of these. Features and benefits of your product and service, which we talked about. What crazy cool stories can you tell? Because sometimes having a unique story is enough to kind of get the door open. And outstanding unique aspects of your process. A lot of people, when I ask people what they're looking for to find, when they want to find a new podcast to listen to, they want actionable tips. They want great stories, but they want actionable tips. So if you have a really great process, and I'll give you a good example of this shortly, of how to do something, or I have a process that's different to how everybody else will tell you to do something, that can be a really, really engaging pitch. The next one, so these are just some examples. These are people who have been on my podcast, so those examples that make you stand out that I mentioned before. This is Kate Johansson. She is a Melbourne girl who started Koja Superfoods, which you may have seen in, gourmet cafes and shops. She was on, I can't remember what episode and I can't see it there, but basically what made her really interesting to me, and I actually pitched her, she didn't pitch me, I asked her to come on the show, was I was watching an episode of Australia's Shark Tank, and she pitched and she won investment. And so immediately I was interested to talk to her, because I'm like, how many people pitched on Shark Tank and actually got money? And she's very firmly in my wellness space. So if you don't have to have pitched on Shark Tank, obviously, but if you've got an interesting story like that, then it definitely should be part of your pitch. The next one is being different. So this is where I talked about, do you have an opinion that's quite different to most in your industry? So this is Ling Wong. She is a business soul work. Business soul work is the name of her business. She was on episode 26 of my podcast, and she pitched me with a topic about why you shouldn't be niching in business. Now, of course, that was going to interest me because most people talk about niching, and I believe in niching. So I wanted to hear how she was approaching this particular topic differently. So if there's things where that you stand for something quite differently to other people in your industry, this is a really good angle to be pitching, especially if you're really wanting to be on a podcast and maybe they've had somebody on. Like if Ling had seen that I'd had somebody on my podcast talking about the importance of niching, then it could be a great opportunity to say to me, I heard that episode and I actually have a completely different perspective on that, and I'd love to come on the show and talk to you about it. That can also make for great content for a podcaster. Recently I had two different PR people on my podcast, almost one after the other, I think they were. One was talking about why you needed to pitch traditional media, and the other was saying you don't need traditional media, it's all about blogging and podcasting. And so it was really fun to have them both on close together and hear both sides of that story. Your unique how-to, Swapna, I don't know if you knew that you were in this presentation, but Swapna was on episode 46 of The Wellness Entrepreneur. I think I was her first podcast interview. She'll correct me if I wasn't, but she has we talked about her covering this 6-step content creation formula. So immediately when you see that title, you're like, ooh, I'm getting an actionable process and tips here. And because I know Swapna, I know how good she is at content. And so being able to put that into a nice 6-step framework is very appealing to me and was also to my audience. As we know, because I just did my top 10 episodes of all time and Swapna's was in there. Your standout story. So this is another one a bit like Koja Superfoods. This is Kira Hug. This is a podcast she was on called the Employable Woman Podcast. She pitched 30 podcasts in 30 days, and then she proceeded to go on to lots of podcasts talking about how she'd pitched 30 podcasts in 30 days. Really interesting kind of way to stand out from just the general, let me come and talk to your audience about how to pitch, which I admit I have done. How much more interesting does it sound when you say, I also want to share the story of me pitching 30 podcasts in 30 days. So think about those sorts of things and what's going to make you stand out from the crowd. If you're doing a formal pitch, which might, I'm talking about like where you're sending an email, you've got the person's contact details, you're sending an email to pitch yourself for their show. What I would suggest that you do first is personally connect first. So if they're a podcaster, it's highly likely that they have a Facebook group. So I would join their Facebook group. I would sign up to their list. I would be listening to their podcast. If they are on Twitter, I'd be tweeting them about their podcast. I would make sure that when I send them this email with my formal pitch, it's not the first time they've heard from me. That just makes it a little bit warmer, and it shows that you've put some effort into getting to know them before you've just blanket pitched them. This, following these sorts of processes can mean it can take a little while to do a pitch for one podcast, but I guarantee it's worth it, and I guarantee it will mean you won't spend time copy and pasting to podcasts that are never going to say yes, because they're the wrong fit. It will amplify your chances of getting a yes. So assuming you've done all that personal connection, it's important to fluff people before you approach them. I love it. #fluff. So you've personally connected with them. Now you're sending them the email. I would be telling them the impact that their work has had on you, even if it's just to say, I really liked the episode that you did with Kate Toon because she's hilarious and she makes SEO actually unboring. Which she does. And so, it could be that simple, but basically a podcaster wants to know that you've actually listened to their show. Is at the heart of why you do that. Yes, it's a formula, but it works. Next, you want to reference the angles that you can speak on. You may just have one angle that you're going straight to them with, this is the topic that I think that will be a real benefit to your audience. Or you might say, there's a couple of topics I thought of that could be a really good fit to your audience, and they are this and this. And then link to social proof. So if you have been on podcasts before, or you are a podcaster, or you've done videos, definitely link to those, because if I get a pitch from someone I've never heard of, I want to know that they can speak. So I like to listen to them interviewed on another show if I possibly can. If you don't have that, that's fine. We've all got to start somewhere. But I would, be linking to other social proof that you have. Now, I have heard people, particularly in the States, talk about having a one sheet. A one sheet is it's just one sheet, funnily enough, which kind of captures, it's basically like your speaker's bio type thing where you're listing your credentials, podcast episodes you've been on, what you've authored, all of that sort of stuff that you can send to people. I don't believe in them for the types of people that I work with and the types of podcasts that I think that most of us would be pitching, I don't think it's necessary. I think if you're pitching Entrepreneur on Fire, then yeah, you probably need a one sheet because they're used to dealing with publicists and all sorts of things. So they're going to expect that level. But most people are just looking for a personal connection and a personal pitch. So I do not believe you need to attach any snazzy CV, just send the email. What I would say, and I probably say it further on, but in case I don't, I'm going to say it here, is check a podcaster's process. If they have on their website a form that they want you to use to pitch, use that form. Don't email them if they've clearly got a form. What will happen is they'll just say, great, can you please fill out the form? Next up is a more informal pitch. So, and I like these too, and I do a lot of them, where it might be that the first email that you want to send is a more informal, connect on a personal level email and ask for permission to pitch. Just, I'm really interested in being on your podcast. I've got lots of ideas for topics that we could discuss. Let me know if you're interested. And that, if you're going to do that, that can be a really great way to just try and be memorable and connecting in that first email. So I got one a little while ago where somebody told me, like, her introduction was basically, I wanted to reach out and tell you how much I enjoy the podcast. I'm traveling in a caravan through the southwest of Western Australia with my husband for the next 12 months, and I listen to your podcast while I'm mountain biking through the Karri Forest. And that's memorable. That, and not just because I'm from WA, so I know exactly the places that she's talking about, because that just stands out and it shows personality. And immediately I was like, yeah, I want to know what you want to talk about. Like, let's continue this conversation. And that sort of uses the psychology of getting a small yes, because if someone says, if you just ask someone to let you pitch to them and they say yes, they've said yes once, so they're more likely to say yes again when you go back to them with a full pitch. So that's another way to think about it. I think you've really got to shift it depending on who you're pitching. I would tend to use an informal pitch more for someone I've already got some sort of connection with, but not always. And I kind of change it depending on who I'm pitching. So think about that. So some tips. Some of these I will have covered already. Listen to the podcasts of those you are going to pitch. Listen to, I would suggest, at least 3 of their shows, even if you listen to them fast, on like 1.5 speed or 2 speed, because you want to make sure that you really understand them, their audience, the type of content that they're making. If they're going, because a lot of podcasters will ask the same opening question or the same closing question or some of the same questions. So you want to be familiar with their format before you pitch them. You don't want to get caught unawares. Connect with them, as I said, in their Facebook group, join their list. If they have a process, follow it. If they have a pitch form, use that. So look at their website before you send the email. And if you can make it a warm pitch by connecting with them first, or even if you know someone that knows them, ask them to, say, like, if someone's a good friend of theirs. I just did this recently. Kate's left, but I said to her, I really want to be on this podcast. Does anyone know the host? And Kate did, because she's been interviewed on her show and was able to make that a slightly warmer introduction for me. And then the fortune is in the follow-up. This, if you haven't got a no, it's not a no. And this is the thing that is really where the mindset crawlies come in, is you go, oh, I pitched that person and they didn't reply. They don't want me. And I've done this. They don't want me, poor me. And it's like, well, actually, they may not have seen the email. I mean, how many emails do we get? They may have seen the email and thought, oh, I've got to get back to her. And then you fell down the list in the inbox and it got forgotten. So definitely follow up with people and, make them say no. if they don't want you on their show, make them actually say no. A lot of people, a lot of podcasters particularly, do a lot of content well in advance of it actually being published. So, for example, my content is pretty much done and scheduled until the end of January. So if someone pitches me now, I'm going to say, look, not now, but come back to me towards the end of the year when I'll be looking at my content for the new year. And a lot of people will take that as, oh, she's fobbing me off because she doesn't actually want me, but she doesn't want to say no. That's not true. And if it's true, keep following me up until I say no. You've got to really follow up and hold yourself accountable until you follow up. Yes, it's not a no until they say no. I just did this recently, followed up with someone that I thought was fobbing me off, and I'm going to be on their podcast next week, and they're awesome. So it works. So finally, on making the pitch, your checklist for your pitch. So this is you can grab these. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, but you can kind of just when you're writing a pitch or coming up with your pitch, think about these questions. Have you addressed a pain or a broader a unique perspective to your industry? Does your topic highlight a need for action and show the process for getting to that action? Are you using interesting or uncommon words that might make your pitch stand out? Will it excite and make your target market antsy to read, hear, get what you've got? And have you credentialized yourself, which is the, referencing other shows you've been on and things like that. Next is about nailing the interview. So we want a hashtag crushed it moment when you get onto that podcast. So as I said, listen to their work so that you're not caught unawares with a standard question that gets asked to everybody. Make sure that you know what those questions are and you've at least had a little bit of a think about what you're going to say. Prepare your space and your equipment. So I would suggest, even if you don't plan on having a podcast yourself, if you want to be on podcasts, I would invest in a decent microphone. You can do that with less than $100. So they don't have to be expensive, but it does really up-level your audio quality, and your podcast host will appreciate that. And it's just, it's a good piece of equipment that's going to serve you well in online business. The other thing is thinking about the space you record in. So don't record on your mobile on a phone call when you're driving between the school run and home. Because it will sound terrible. I listened to a podcast recently. I'm pretty forgiving with audio, but I listened to a very, very well-known podcast recently who was interviewing somebody very, very well-known, and she was sitting in a cafe doing the interview, and not together. I'd probably forgive it if they were sitting together because that would be a whole experience type thing, but she had just not even prioritized that podcast enough to do the interview from a good space. So think about where in your house you would record. I would be choosing the most textured room in the house, basically. So you want a carpeted room, you want a room that's going to absorb sound, so you can draw the blinds or no windows. Preferably not lots of glass, not floorboards, not tiles. So I'm in a carpeted room now, but I have quite a hard desk. So I went to IKEA and I'll show you. I bought this doormat, but it's bright red and it's shaped like a semicircle. And I put that under my desk and my mic, and it just absorbs a lot of the sound. So that can be really useful. Now, Claire asked, what mic do I recommend? I love mine. Mine is the Blue Yeti, and that's my pop filter, which you want to buy. You can buy them on eBay for like $20, $30. And the reason that is there is so that when you're talking, you don't get lots of the sounds. And you can always tell if somebody's using a mic without a pop filter. So you definitely want one of those. The pop filters are cheap. The Blue Yeti is just over $100, I think. The other one that I recommend through my course is the ATR 2100, which is also as impressively phallic as that is. Can I say that? But it's personal preference then. But I do some podcasting on the move. So Elle and I on our Lady Boss Chats podcast, we did one in the car together, and we've got little Smart Lav lapel mics for that. And then I use the phone to record, and that's really cool. But obviously we're not talking about actually podcasting. We're talking about being interviewed on a podcast. So I'd be setting up your space in the home. I'd also think about Netflix and pets. This was something, I say pets laughingly because my dog is next to me snoring, and she is on pretty much every podcast that I do. But if I was being interviewed on someone's podcast, I wouldn't want her snoring on it because it's not my show. Netflix, if you're podcasting in your house over Skype, I learned this at We Are Podcast, great tip. Make sure the kids aren't in the other room streaming on Netflix, or because that's going to kill your Skype connection, which is kind of hard when we're probably using Netflix to babysit the kids while we're doing the podcast interview, but just worth thinking about how we manage those logistics. And then most podcasters will require a bio with all your links plus a headshot. So easy way to do this is just create a Dropbox folder or a Google Drive folder where you put that stuff, and then you can just share the link with all the hosts that you're going to be on their show. During the show, so you're crushing it, you've crushed your prep, now we're going to crush it during the interview, is just have a really specific call to action. Like I don't like when people reel off 5 or 6 different links because most podcasters will ask you at the end, how can people connect with you? And I hear people reel off 5, 6 links and places, and that just says to me, I have no idea where you should connect with me, so don't connect with me. Or they say, go to my website, everything is there. And that's not very specific either. So I send people to my Facebook group because I want to connect with people in my Facebook group. That's a personal preference. Or another thing that some people, you may want to think about doing is creating a nice little opt-in giveaway that aligns nicely to the topic that you're talking about and offer that. But I would talk to the host first about doing that. But make it specific. Know where you want to send people and send them there. If it's your Instagram, send them there. Whatever it is, but just be specific. And afterwards, say thank you. Follow up with any links that you might have mentioned on the show just to make it easier for them to create show notes. Nice one, Swapna. The content queen has said, send them to a landing page with a freebie that is a natural next step for them. That is like podcast guest gold. Like if someone did that for me, I would be telling all my podcasting friends to have that person on their show because you've really added value. Afterwards, with the thank you, I would suggest if that person's on Twitter particularly, because Twitter's just a really easy place to have those types of conversations, thank them on Twitter. Actually shout them out on Twitter and tag them and say, I was so excited to be interviewed on the show, can't wait to hear it, just to create a little bit of noise and vibe, and they'll appreciate that. We all appreciate a shout out on social media. Next, you've crushed it. Well done. Boom, you've crushed it. Now the episode is published. You want to get the mileage out of that show. You want to make it work for your business and work for your brand. So always remember this, what they want. What the podcaster wants is your podcast shared and shared widely, aka we want more downloads. We do. We want engagement more than that, but we want more downloads. What you want is more visibility and cred, new leads, not to be spammy. We know why we're pitching. So you have to think, well, how can I get what I want and give what they want for having me on their show? So what to do? Create some banter on social media. So this is what I was talking about with thanking them. And then when the show comes out, thank them again and share it and have a bit of back and forth banter about the show. Who did I see? Leonie Percy, who I think she's signed up, but she might watch in the future. So hi, Leonie, if she is. She did an episode recently with Ron Sleevaz, who has the Bond Appetit podcast, and I saw them in a Facebook group having this whole banter about some of the very crazy topics that had come up during their interview. Now, I saw that. It was hysterical because there were like, there was vaginas and I think tigers and lions and all the weird stuff came up. I don't know how they got onto these topics, but I saw that banter and went, that's really cool. I need to listen to that episode. So think about how you can keep that conversation going with the host in a social realm. Then share the episode on social media, tell your list, include your host logo on your website as a featured on person. If your host allows it, you can share the content on your website. You can even put a podcast player on your website if you have like a WordPress site or a site that's easy to put one of those plugins, and ask them if you can put the player there and it will link back to their feed and play the show. Like, how good would that be? I would love that if somebody did that for me. And then return the favor. If you have a podcast, invite them onto your show if they're a good fit for your audience, and share something of theirs. Like, actually think about, how can I take this relationship to another level? How can I help them? Or, offering guest suggestions. Often podcasters are really looking hard for quality guests, and they're not always that easy to find. So if you do a great interview, suggest 3 of people in your network that you think would do a fabulous interview too. So think about all of that stuff. I'll tell you, a lot of people don't pitch podcasters because they think, oh, I don't have a big enough name. My experience, and I've talked about this with other podcasters, is that the big names don't promote your stuff because they don't need to. So it's actually the people with the small engaged communities who I know they're gonna know about that podcast episode. They are much more appealing to me in terms of marketing the show and helping me get more reach for my show. So definitely think about that. What player do I recommend? Claire, I recommend the Blueberry player, but that's because that's what I use. There's a few out there. Clamour, I think, has a player for the webs for a player plugin. I think there's a Smart Player. I think Pat Flynn has one. There's quite a few.
I hope that gave you lots of ideas for pitching podcasts. I've also implemented hashtag pitch day in my Podcaster Posse Facebook group, where people can share what they're looking for, if they're looking for guests or they're looking for interview opportunities. So jump into the group if you're not already and check this out. The URL is bit.ly/pod posse. See you next week, where I am bringing a UK mindset coach and entrepreneur and author and podcaster to the show. A really awesome story. Can't wait to connect with you again. Happy empire designing. Hey, we've loved contributing to your empire building today. Please share us with a fellow empire builder so that we can help them too. Thank you to Luke at The Wellness Pro for production and editing, the Virtually Holistic Hub for show notes and admin support, to our guest, and to you, our most important listener. You should also check out my other podcast, Lady Boss Chats, where Elle Roberts and I chat all things Lady Boss life. You'll feel like you've just pulled up a cozy armchair with your biz bestie. Find us in your favourite podcast app or at theladybossproject.com.